What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're having a look at the incredible game played between Vincent Keymer, the German Grandmaster, and Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT of chess, in the Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament. And in this game, Magnus will be on the back foot immediately out of the opening. You don't want to miss this game. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Vincent Keymer is playing as white. Now here, the strongest moves for white in this position in freestyle chess include 1 f4, 1 c4, knight to b3, and knight to g3. However, instead, in this game, Vincent Keymer opening up on the queen side with the g-pawn. 1 g4 is the move, opening up with the queen's pawn. And what is black going to do about it? Well, the strongest move here for Magnus is actually g5, playing very symmetrical, very solid. Instead, 1 knight g6 was chosen by the GOAT. Now, Vincent, knight to b3 is the move, getting his knight out into the game. And here, black goes e5, gaining space and contrasting his pawn advance with white's one on the g4 square, getting his knight developed behind that pawn on g4. Perhaps that was the idea behind 1 g4 played in the opening. Now here, black goes f6, bolstering his pawn on e5 and opening up the scope of this queen on the g8 square, slicing down this diagonal. Now here, Vincent gains space on the queen side with the move c4, opening up with the rook's pawn, the rook supporting that pawn on the c4 square. And here, Magnus Carlsen plays a very, very interesting move. He actually castles on the queen side. Queenside castles is the move, just shuffling his king and his rook here, king to c8, castling on the queen side. Now here, Vincent, he decides it is time to gain space in the center of the board. d4 was chosen. Of course, that pawn is being supported by the knight on the b3 square. And here, instead of taking on d4, e takes d4 is clearly the strongest idea for black. Instead, Magnus, he plays a very provocative idea, knight b6, putting pressure on that pawn on c4 with both the knight and the queen. However, Vincent Keymer, he has a very simple idea to gain space in the center and relieve all the tension on both these pawns on c4 and d4. Here, Vincent simply goes d5, gaining space, and already on move 6, Vincent Keymer has a commanding advantage out of the opening here, and Magnus will be on the back foot. It's sort of like a modern Ben and I opening, where white obviously has a very strong space advantage on the queen side and in the center. All right, here, black goes d6, getting his pawn triangle in the center of the board. All his pawns are on dark squares, and the problem with this setup here is that bishop on b8 is completely out of the game for now. Now, Vincent, bishop f5 is the move, hitting the king on c8 with the bishop immediately. Black goes bishop d7, and here, Vincent, he doesn't trade yet. Instead, f3 is the move, getting almost all his pawns here on light squares. Perhaps he wants to trade off his light squared bishop, trying to give black a very bad dark squared bishop in the corner of the board. That is a big part of why white is so much better here. His bishop is just dominating black's one on b8. All right, now black goes a6, controlling that b5 square, potentially setting up a b5 advance later in the game. And now Vincent, he continues with his light squared strategy. He goes e4, gaining space, getting all of his center pawns on light squares here. And the idea being, if black takes on f5, white can recapture with the knight or the g-pawn, recapturing towards the center. And again, he has the entire center on complete lockdown. Now black here, he goes for the move, knight to f4, jumping down with the knight, potentially threatening g6 ideas. Therefore here, Vincent, he just goes bishop takes d7, trading off those light squared bishops, a perfectly fine idea. And now we have rook takes d7. Now here, Vincent plays another very curious looking move. The strongest moves according to the engine include knight a5, developing the knight on the queen side, and queen to e3, centralizing the queen. But instead here, Vincent goes king to c2, getting his king off that back rank. Now, of course, a big part of the idea here, the king may want to go to b1, sort of artificially castling the king, but we'll have to wait and see what Vincent has in mind with that move. All right, now here, Magnus plays yet another very weird-looking move. Bishop to a7, getting his bishop on this diagonal where it does oppose the white queen on g1. Of course, black is threatening ideas like potentially knight takes c4. Of course, the bishop on a7 is undefended, but if the king ever goes to b8, then ideas like knight takes c4 would come into play. And real fast, why did black not take on c4 immediately? Well, it's very simple. If you take on c4, then white can go bishop f2, closing off this diagonal, and that knight on c4 will not have any good retreat squares. If you go back to b6 in the future, then bishop takes b6 would be deadly, and overall, knight takes c4 is just a little bit too risky here for black. Instead, bishop a7 played in the game, again opposing the white queen on g1. Now we have bishop d2, developing the bishop and threatening the knight on the f4 square. And again, if black goes knight takes f4, then you immediately lose that bishop on a7. Therefore, that pawn is still not hanging. So here, Magnus, king b8 is the move, simply defending that bishop on a7. And now, of course, knight takes c4 is officially a threat here. And with that in mind, Vincent does go bishop e3, defending his queen on g1 from the X-ray attack. Now, Magnus, he is not done. Knight to h3, putting pressure on the queen. And now, of course, g1 and f2 are being attacked. That means the queen will have to leave the bishop on e3 undefended for now. In the game, queen g2 was chosen, putting pressure on the knight on h3. Very logical. Black draws back, knight to f4. And here, Vincent, if he wanted it, he could actually go for a draw immediately on the spot. For example, queen g1, knight h3, queen g2, knight f4. That would be a threefold draw by repetition immediately. However, Vincent Keymer on move 15, he is playing for a win, and instead of queen g1, he simply goes queen to f2, sliding over his queen, and again, maintaining the pressure on the bishop on a7. Now here, black, instead of knight to h3, he actually goes h5, gaining space on the king side, and seemingly playing a temporary pawn sacrifice. If white wants it, he can take on h5 with the knight or the g-pawn, and it's actually not clear how black will regain the pawn in the future. Instead, though, rook fd1 chosen by the German grandmaster. Now we have h takes g4, then f takes g4, and then knight to c8, dropping back with the knight, and of course, increasing the tension on the bishop on e3. Now, does white want to trade on a7, or does he want to keep those bishops on the board for now? Well, it turns out he wants to keep them alive. He goes c5 instead, gaining space on the queen side in the spirit of perhaps the king's Indian defense. Now, black takes on c5, white takes back, bishop takes c5, and then black goes g6. Kind of a curious move, again, not doing a whole lot on the king side. Now here, white does trade those bishops. Bishop takes a7 is the move. Then we have knight takes a7, and then king to b1, completing the artificial castling of the king on the b1 square. Now we have queen to h7, getting the queen off the back rank, then knight c5, jumping up with the knight, and pressuring that weak rook on d7. Where is the rook going to go? It goes to d6, a very logical square for that rook, and now we have knight to e2, dropping back with the knight, and increasing the pressure on that knight on f4. And so far, overall, Vincent Keymer, he maintains a very solid advantage in this position. Of course, his pawns on d4 and d5, and e4 are very, very strong, and black has a slight space disadvantage. All right, now here black trades on e2, knight takes e2, then queen takes e2, and then black jumps up with the knight to b5. So knight b5 played in the game. Magnus trying to reroute his pieces to better squares. Of course, now the idea could be rook d8, then knight d6. That knight does belong on that d6 square, blockading the pawn on d5. But overall, this plan is a little bit slow. And here Vincent, he lunges out with the queen, queen c4, a very strong move, pressuring that weak pawn on c7. Now here black does go rook c8, defending c7 in advance with the rook. There are no queen takes c7 ideas coming in the future. Now white goes a4, gaining space and driving back that knight once again before black can go rook d8 and then knight d6. Instead, knight to d4 is played in the game, jumping forward with the knight. But here Vincent Keymer plays an extremely strong pawn sacrifice, g5. The idea being you are putting pressure on that pawn on f6, and if you take on g5, then the pawn on e5 also becomes very, very weak. Overall, black's pawn structure will be damaged one way or another. Now here, instead of trading on g5, black actually goes rook c to d8, sliding his rook out to the d8 square. But here white just takes on f6. G takes f6 played in the game. Then we have rook takes f6, and then rook to f1, sliding over with the rook. Now here black goes rook b6, retreating his rook back to b6. c6 as well. Now rook f2 develops the rook and defends that b2 point in advance. And now here, Magnus, g5 is the move, increasing the pressure on that very, very weak pawn on e4. Of course, for now, it is supported by the knight on c5. Therefore, queen takes e4 is not a threat yet. Now, white goes king to a2, developing his king off the back rank. Black does the same, king to a7. And now we have rook c to f1, sliding over with that rook. Now here, the strongest move for black is actually rook to g8, getting his rook behind that very important pawn on g5. Instead, Magnus goes g4, pushing his pawn down the board, but this move turns out to be considerably weaker. And here, Vincent has a very simple tactical shot to nearly decide the game on the spot. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Vincent Keymer right here in this position. Of course, the key move for white is gonna be rook to f7, pressuring both the queen on h7 and that pawn on f7. For example, rook f7 is the strongest move. If black takes the pawn on h2, queen takes h2, then you can just go rook 1 to f2, defending b2 in advance, and of course, you will win that pawn on c7 and have a massive attack. But instead of all this, here in this position, queen c3 was played, defending b2 with the queen in advance, and this move is a lot weaker. And here, Magnus is going to have chances to fight back in this game. All right, black continues, knight to f3, pressuring the weak pawn on the h2 square. Now we have rook g2, sliding over with the rook and pressuring the g4 pawn. Now rook g8 also defends that pawn on g4. Now we have rook f to f2, jumping up with the rook. Now we have rook d6, sliding over with the rook, queen to e3, king to a8, and here Vincent Keymer, he plays a very, very strong idea, knight to e6, jumping in with the knight, pressuring c7, and potentially forcing out a weakening move from black. And here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, overall, he's still doing relatively okay so far in this game, but right here, he makes an absolutely fatal mistake. He plays the move c6. Now, what is the problem with this move? It turns out white has a very powerful tactical idea, taking advantage of some of the weaknesses in the black camp right here, right now. And if you like puzzles, once again, pause the video and try to find the key idea for black right here in this position. Well, it turns out white is going to slide his queen over, queen to a3, pressuring the weak rook on d6. And have a look at this. No matter what black does in this position, he is going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, what did black do in the game? It turns out Magnus Carlsen, he's in so much pressure, he actually gave up his rook for the knight. Rook takes e6. However, that was not the end of his problems. And real fast, I want to point out, no matter what you do here as black, you are in a lot of trouble. If you go rook d8, you lose the rook to knight takes d8. Instead, rook d7 is met by knight to f8, forking the rook on d7 and the queen on h7. Instead, if you go, say, I don't know, queen to e7 here, trying to defend that rook, then simply rook takes f3 wins that knight, as if you take the rook, you win the rook on g8. No matter what black does here, he is in a tremendous amount of pressure. Now, I do want to point out the strongest move, according to the engine, is c5 here. The idea being if you take the pawn, then black goes rook to d7, and here if you go knight to f8, then bang, queen takes e4, picks up that pawn, and black is going to have a decent amount of counterplay. Now instead, in the game, rook takes e6 was chosen by the goat, white takes back, d takes e6, and here the final move of the game is simply rook to c8, and here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, he actually resigned on the spot to Vincent Keymer. I mean, white is just completely winning in this position. There are many, many different ways to win. The strongest move here is simply rook takes g4, winning that free pawn, threatening queen takes f3, and so on. And as you can see by the eval bar on the left, showing plus 5.4 pawns, I mean, that is just a tremendous advantage. So it's very understandable why Magnus did resign in this position. Either way, Magnus, he lost his first semifinals game against Vincent Keymer. But of course, the semifinals match is a best of 2 game scenario, meaning tomorrow Magnus will play Vincent Keymer as white with the same starting position, and he will have his chance to fight back and try to equalize the score and go to tie breaks. But if he doesn't do that, if Vincent Keymer holds on and gets at least a draw, Magnus will be out in the tournament. That would be a truly shocking turn of events. So stick around until tomorrow to see what happens there, but don't go anywhere. We've also got 2 incredible Title Tuesday games. The first one featuring Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura. So let's load it up here and dive right in.